You're listening to Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, John Lawson, and joining me this week, I have my co-host returning once again, Matthew Fisher. Welcome.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me. Good to be back.
And yeah, great to have you back. And we've also got a returning guest. We haven't had him on for a while, but he was actually one of our first guests on the podcast. And it's a shame we haven't had you on more often because your insight is always valuable. And our guest is, of course, Barclay McGain, a Liberal Party operative, or I'd say conservative operative, I'd say more broadly, because he was, of course, kicked out of the party for being conservative. And that's quite a story in itself. I'll link to our original podcast with Barclay if anyone wants to go read up on that or listen up on that. But this week, I wanted to have Barclay on, well, Matthew and I wanted to have him on to discuss recent developments in conservative politics more broadly, but Australian specifically, especially talking about the upcoming election, the Queensland election, which Barclay is a particular expert on, and also a little bit on the American sphere as well, if we have time. So welcome to the podcast, Barclay. Just give the audience a little intro to yourself. I know I already went into it, but
Yeah, g'day lads. Thanks for having me on. A huge fan of the podcast, and yeah, no, I just g'day listeners. This is my second time being on the podcast, but yeah, so I've just come back from 6 months over in the United States. But prior to that, I was involved in the LNP since I was 16. And then I was rightly suspended after ascending to the role of Gold Coast Young LNP chair. We did a promotional video at Schoolies Week, trying to put the Gold Coast on the map a little bit. As young conservatives, trying to show that we're down with the youth. Of course, we're always told that the older generation are the type of people who will vote conservative, and we thought, well, I think you're seeing it play out now that Gen Z is starting to vote more right wing, and we were trying to kind of lead that. And the reason where I fell foul of the woke media kind of thing was one of the people who I was interviewing, when I asked them, should we keep our Australian flag and national anthem, they said, oh, we've got to stop celebrating a culture that couldn't invent the bloody wheel. And for that crime of simply holding the microphone in that interview and chuckling, I was cancelled by the media. And I think it's a great shame that we don't have conservative institutions that can back up people who do come out and say stuff that might even just be controversial, but it's the truth. And I think we're in politics because we are striving for the truth. We're striving for a better Australia, and that comes from being able to talk about uncomfortable facts. We live in a democracy which thrives on free speech, and that was something that I fell foul of. And I think really, I'm going to call it an injustice. Whilst I don't think I'm a victim, I've never been one to take that label of victim, but I do think it was an injustice. And I do think that as a culture, we do need to be a bit more tolerant of others' viewpoints, and be more willing to have a discussion about these kind of issues, particularly about how, if we talk about that particular issue, how we are going to close the gap between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, and ways that we do that, which are actual, I guess, covert racism, but the other kind of racism, I suppose, in the form of Indigenous procurement policy, a voice to Parliament. I would call all these kind of forms of, I guess, alternate racism, I guess you could say, and or if we're going to have a more a pragmatic approach, which deals with actually helping people who are drug addicted, helping people who are from broken families. And getting people into a job and getting a better livelihood. But yeah, so since then, I've just been involved and spurred on in activism. I've been involved in a number of different causes. So yeah, against the Voice to Parliament, more recently, and coming up in the next couple of weeks in Queensland, we've got the March for Life. I'm very much a supporter of life, and I was super stoked when I was over in the US to be a part of the March for Life. And yeah, I guess so. I've been involved in politics the last 5 years. I was affected by the COVID vaccine too, and that was something I was very outspoken against. The vaccine mandates, as someone who is personally affected by it. And then I suppose, yeah, being over in the US for the last 6 months for the federal election, or the presidential election rather, was just an incredible time. I was over there. I was fortunate enough to get a graduate job with a group called Americans for Tax Reform, and I was working in labour policy. So I was talking about all the things and all the regulations that affect businesses being able to employ people, and workers being able to get ahead and not being forced to join a union, which they are in a lot of US states that don't have the right to work. So that was something that I would frequently talk about and write about over in the US. I was based in Washington, D.C., so I got to be there at the coalface when the Trump administration was being sworn in. Of course, his inauguration was done indoors. I believe they said it was because of the blizzard-like conditions, but I truly do believe it was partially because there was a threat that they couldn't truly control about him being assassinated. He's got such a target on his back. But I was fortunate enough to be there after his inauguration at Capital One Arena, where he signed a number of executive orders, big things like pulling out of the Paris climate agreements, basically giving the United States domestic legislators, democratically elected politicians, the ability to decide on the United States energy policies, aside from an international agreement from a decade ago. And also declaring that there are only two genders, men and women. That was something I was absolutely stoked to see him sign. And again, I started the conversation off talking about truth in politics. And that is something that I really do think Trump stands for. And that's why you have a lot of these people or a lot of these supporters who are almost blindly supporting Trump. And of course, you can never truly blindly support someone, but he's saying the things, the nuggets of truth that people have just like pussyfooted around about and chosen not to even discuss. So things like the fact there are only two genders. So that's why, when Trump says something, a little colorful language, or they dig up his past about having multiple relationships and even affairs and things like that, people are more willing to overlook them because they say, well, look, the guy has faults, but he's out there saying the truth, which no one else is. So that was something that I was privy to. It's an interesting phenomenon in its own right. But now I'm settled back in Brisbane. I'm keen to make this my home for the rest of my life. As much as I loved it over there in the US, and I definitely feel like I could easily live there as someone who is politically engaged and interested. I do feel that long term, the grass isn't always greener on the other side. It's greener where you water it. And I've got a great community here with my church, with my friends who are involved in politics, and a great community. And it's somewhere I feel I can have a bit more of an impact. I mean, the US is a country of 350 million people. In Australia, we've only got about 25, 26 million. And political engagement in Australia, despite the fact that we have compulsory voting, is just so dismally low. And I think whilst that is a negative, it's also an opportunity in that the people who are involved in politics, they can have a far greater impact than they would have otherwise thought. Aside from just being a voter at a ballot box, people can be involved in a political party, be involved even in a march, or handing out at a booth on election day. So that's really one thing that I've, a number of experiences there that I'm touching on that inform my current outlook on politics and the reason why I'm very passionate, mostly about getting young people more involved in politics. That's probably my raison d'etre. And sorry for that really long introduction there, lads. But yeah, I just thought I'd catch everyone up to speed who didn't maybe listen to the first podcast, and why I love coming on and sharing my opinion to people like yourselves. So yeah.
Yeah, no,
No, I
thanks
think,
for joining us.
yeah, that was a perfect summary, especially at the end where you're talking about how, often we look to America, or we look to Europe, and we wish, that could happen here in Australia, but it only takes one person like you, Barclay, to have such a massive difference, organising events, going to marches, talking to politicians, handing out, going in the streets. And so really there's a massive opportunity because when you compare Australia to other countries, our political scene is quite barren in terms of active participation. So it really is something we can get involved with.
Definitely,
And
yeah.
following on from a bit what you said about uh, our current conservative establishment in Australia, we have seen quote unquote successes recently in Queensland, your home state, around the recent state election. And now, last time we talked about predictions around the upcoming election, and we all came to the conclusion that the LNP would win on the basis of successive political nightmares for the Labor Party. What do you think about the election? Was it a secure win for the LNP, or did they leave stuff on the table that they could have won?
Definitely. Well, I think first and foremost, it has to be pointed out that I wasn't here in the country for the last state election, but I was, of course, watching it very, very closely. I've got a number of friends who are even running, and some of which are now even MPs, and a lot of people who are helping out as volunteers on the day. And yeah, of course, it was a change of government. I think as a product of the change in government, largely it was driven by the fact that we've had Labor for 9 years here in Queensland. Anastasia Palaszczuk was broadly popular in the sense that she was seen as keeping Queensland safe. To be honest, I hate that rhetoric. I think that the idea of a government keeping people safe, particularly during an invisible virus, is actually incredibly dishonest of people to write in the media.
Yeah,
Partic-
draconian even, if you would.
yeah, exactly, it's actually. I mean, I remember in 2020 when we lost that state election, Anastasia Palaszczuk walked out to the song "Won't Back Down" by Tom Petty. That iconic song "Won't Back Down." That was supposed to be for people who get into a fight and they choose not to back down. But her version of "Won't Back Down" is "Won't let you outside of your home." So she's not going to back down on her policy, which says you can't leave your home and that you have to get jabbed in order to get a job. Which I just think was an incredible reversal of what the truth was. But yeah, she was rewarded by it. I mean, there was so many people, particularly in that 2020 state election. And you got to remember, it was 2020. It wasn't 2021 or 2022 where people were kind of beginning to wake up a little bit. It was still 2020, and people were still, in many ways, quite scared about the coronavirus. Vaccine hadn't even been conceived yet at that point. But yeah, she got re-elected in 2020 and was broadly popular. And then Stephen Miles came along, and he was always the attack dog for the Labor Party, and really just a political hack. I think he is technically a doctor, but I think his doctorate was in union participation rates. He was a union hack his entire life. So, he was never going to be the favorite to win. I think David Crisafulli is a slick politician. He speaks very well. He's very polished. I think it was an interview with his dad. The interviewer asked, "Oh, what was David like growing up?" And the dad said he always wanted to be a politician. So,
Oh,
David's really
gosh.
been, yeah, David's really been preparing for this his entire life. I don't know if that's necessarily an endorsement or
No.
criticism of David. I'll let the audience maybe decide that one. But I think a very interesting state election. Now, of course, people would have been anticipating for the LNP to win, but I think they probably anticipated them to win by a lot more. And I think the reason why it seemed to fumble at the last minute for the LNP and wasn't as strong as they would have thought would have been the abortion issue. And it's a shame that the US election coincided very, very strongly with the Queensland state election. Indeed, it'd be fair to say that because of how disengaged people are with their local politics here in Australia, there was probably more Queenslanders more invested in the outcome of the US election than they were in the outcome of the Queensland state election. We saw Labor, textbook. They took the abortion issue, which has played out over the last 4 years in the US with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and transported that into Queensland. And we saw that play out very well. There was corporates at just about every second polling booth saying that if you vote for the LNP, then you'll see the rewinding back of our state's abortion laws. And I look at that, I look at a corporate like that, and I just think, yes, indeed we do. And I think that even someone like David Crisafulli, who I fully understand has to toe a fine line of realizing that, hey, yeah, the issue of abortion is a tricky one, particularly the younger generation, particularly people in metro areas where he's trying to win seats, are loosely pro-choice. But I think he needs a better way to deal with it, because right now, or maybe if we go back to October, Stephen Miles tried to introduce a binary. It was you're either pro-life or pro-choice, and they knew that if you were tied to pro-life, that they would tie you to the worst elements of what people think it means to be pro-life, which is that when the life of the mother's in danger, you force the mother to still have that child, or that instead of punishing the doctor who administers the abortion, you actually punish the woman who is seeking to have that done. I guess they're called abolitionists more so, and that's what Stephen Miles was trying to do. He was trying to tie people who, the victim of a rape, to saying that they can't get an abortion, and of course, whether that's my view or not, it's not going to be done, at least in my lifetime, I don't think, particularly given the current discussion on the abortion topic. But yeah, David Crisafulli, he essentially played along. He took the bait and he turned it into a binary as to whether he would commit to being pro-life or pro-choice. And of course, the Liberal Party is very divided on this issue, and there's a lot of people that are unhappy with his stance, which he ultimately took, which is that he was pro-choice. And now I think the way in which he needed to approach this, instead of, and what he's now done since becoming premier, has guillotine debate on abortion, which is disgraceful in my view and very anti-democratic. Instead, what he ought have done would be saying, look, I fully understand and I respect the views of people who believe in a woman's right to choose, but fundamentally, Labor's legislation that they passed in 2017 or 18 was fundamentally flawed because it allowed for gender selective abortions. And that's exactly true. The fact that you can abort a baby up until 22 weeks means that in Queensland, in current law, you are able to abort children or babies, fetuses, based on their gender. So if
And
you yeah, go ahead.
also to add to that, babies born alive during abortions, you are required to give them no medical aid. So it's a baby out of the womb,
Yeah,
independent of the mother, and they throw them away into a bin and just hear it scream out for help, for love, and that is completely contrary to human love and
yeah,
ability as people. But people don't know that. People don't know what the legislation is, and as you're alluding to, Chris Fully played by Labor's rules. Labor set the
yeah.
rules out, and what was ironic is Wayne Swan kept trying to run this narrative that the LNP were running a Trump Republican playbook, that they were the American side, when the Labor
Mm.
Party were running a playbook straight out from the Democrats. Fear mongering, as you were talking
Exactly, yeah.
about, painting these worst case scenarios. Using these extreme cases of heinous acts to justify the 99 point whatever percent of abortions which are elective abortions.
Exactly. And that's why I think David Christoffel had to try and break free from the binary of either being in the pro-life camp or the pro-choice camp and take a more nuanced approach. And he could simply have done that by all of us on the podcast here are young. We know that there are some crazy feminists in our age group who are delusionally pro-life. But one thing pro-choice rather, but one other thing they are is they're feminists. And if you appeal to those kind of people, and say, hey, just so you know, under these abortion laws which you so proudly support, you know that anyone is able to abort a child just because they are female. And that should not sit right with anyone, even people who are on the left, because they, of course, believe in third wave feminism. They ought, suddenly think, okay, well, maybe this guy, David Christoffel, does have a point. Maybe we can protect a woman's right to choose and begin to unwind Labor's abortion legislation. And then hopefully the new legislation which is introduced is at least shifting the pendulum. And this is something that I spoke about very recently at an immigration event, which I hosted with the activist Jordan Knight. Now, as we know, on the topic of immigration, which is hopefully, or at least in my opinion, it's starting to dominate the federal election and how it relates to things like home ownership. A lot of people might look at what Labor's done the last few years and rightly think this is insane. We're having 600,000 new migrants come here each year. And then they hear Peter Dutton's proposal, which is a 25% reduction, and think, well, that's good, but not enough. And one thing that I caution a lot of people who hear that, and as a result, they become black-pilled. They say, oh, neither Peter Dutton nor Anthony Albanese represent me. One thing that I'd at least encourage them to is recognize that it's at least a shift in the Overton window. The Overton window being the ideas within a society which are deemed to be palatable and acceptable. And that's something that I think we can make criticisms up all day long, but Peter Dutton is at least shifting the Overton window on this topic in a way that I don't believe Scott Morrison did. And I think that finally we are seeing a shifted discussion. Now, is it enough? No. But the Overton window is simply about shifting those ideas. And that's what I think Christopher could have done in Australia, or in Queensland rather, on the abortion topic. But right now, anyone who dares speak out or speaks foul of Labor's clearly flawed termination of pregnancy bill is just put in the category of crazy right wing pro-lifers, same as like the Westboro Baptist Church who go and screech outside of abortion clinics, that kind of thing. So I think and there's a playbook here. There is a playbook. The Donald Trump has really shifted the Overton window of politics in the United States. I mean, you've seen it. I mean, to give you an idea, the most recent Republican presidential candidate prior to Donald Trump was Mitt Romney, who is now seen as way too left wing, or not pro Trump enough rather, for the Republican Party. And why? It's because he's shifted the Overton window. Now the Overton window says that people like Mitt Romney, who used to be the establishment Republicans, are actually the anti-establishment Republicans, and Trump is the new establishment. So it can happen, in Trump's case, it was a decade, and now I think it might take a lot longer in Australia. But I'm going to live for many decades, so we will see. We will see how it's able to transfer, and hopefully we can see a real reawakening of people in Gen Z. And I hate to go back to it, but that's exactly what podcasts like these are brilliant for. That really shifting the young kind of demographic and getting them more activated and engaged in politics. So yeah.
Just on
Well,
the
can I
idea
jump in
of
there quickly, Matthew?
sure.
Yeah, a lot of what Barclay's saying is very pertinent. It does. I think you're right that what Dutton is saying is not enough to satisfy Gen Z, especially young right wingers, because frankly, all of us are completely bored with the style of conservative politics, which might have appealed to yesteryear's young liberal, uh, someone that was maybe a wet or something like that. They believed in economic policy, or they were part of the upper middle class and went to a private school, something like that, and they got into the Liberal Party for sensible centre right politics. That just doesn't really seem. That's not really an archetype that exists these days in Gen Z. If you're a right winger among our generation, you're probably watching some pretty edgy stuff. You're probably, you're probably talking, more than 25% immigration restriction. You're probably talking about the quality of the immigration as well, in terms of what countries they're coming from, some of the problems in those societies, why they're breaking down, why we wouldn't want people from there to come live here, all these sorts of questions, which is, it's years and years ahead of where the conservative sphere is in Australia. I mean, we even look at the US, and it's embarrassing to look at the US or Europe and then compare that to our country, where you, like yourself, you get kicked out of the party for criticizing minorities. Whereas in the US, Trump is, for all of his faults, and there are many, he is so much more to the right than any offering in Australia. For example, we look at his criticism of um, Haitian migrants in Springfield, Ohio, and how they were eating cats and dogs during the debates leading up to the election. Can anyone even imagine a Liberal Party politician, let alone the leader of the Liberal Party, coming close to saying something like that? I don't think we can.
Yeah.
Especially
Yeah,
when they
even
get kicked
Latham
out for
probably fell
saying,
short a little bit.
especially considering recently the Liberal Party has kicked out a prospective candidate down in New South Wales for saying something as innocuous as women shouldn't be in combat roles in the army.
Yeah,
How can we
exactly.
go from that
Mm.
level of self censorship within the Liberal Party to something as free as Trump over in America?
Exactly. And
Yeah. No,
even other
it's very
things as well.
disappointing.
Like,
Yeah.
of course, in Victoria, there was a candidate, well, I think it was an MP who was kicked out for saying that he prays that abortion will end in Australia, things like that, which are, I'd say, even more mild in terms of what is publicly acceptable than talking about the feminism issue, which can be even, well, I suppose that they're bound up together. Either way, but they're both pretty center right issues, based around anti-feminism, and the Liberal Party is completely intolerant of people that are appealing to the next generation of the right wing. And it seems like they're completely got their head stuck in the ground. And what we see in our country's leadership is downstream from that,
Yeah,
where,
I'll just
yeah,
mention,
go.
yeah, because it's a very good point that you raised, John, and it is particularly just affecting people who stray further to the right than the Liberal Party platform, because it's not a case of us just having a very, very narrowly minded idea of you cannot stray slightly from Liberal Party policy. No, it's only you get condemned if you stray to the right of Liberal Party policy. So,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, at the Voice to Parliament, when all of the MPs were saying, "Hey, we respect your own conscience as MPs," but something like the Voice to Parliament is pretty antithetical to the idea of meritocracy, which is a founding word in the Liberal Party constitution. The idea that you should be judged on your merit and the content of your individual actions and words, as opposed to immutable characteristics. But then you saw Bridget Archer for a solid month. She's a federal MP down in Tasmania who was pro-yes, and she was a Liberal MP, or she is a Liberal MP, pounding the pavement with Anthony Albanese. I mean, just today we've seen that there's, if we take the case of Ben Britton, who's shamefully been disendorsed in New South Wales solely for saying something which a lot of Australians think holds a lot of merit, and was actually coming from a place not of anti-feminism, but rather a truer form of feminism, which is recognizing the beautiful role that women play in our society as childbearers.
That's a bit cringe. That's a bit cringe, Barclay.
Yeah. Well, no, in my opinion, I mean, without them, we wouldn't have children. I don't know how that's impossible to disagree with. I mean, I wouldn't call it feminism. I would call it more traditional gender roles.
Yeah, exactly. I
But
wouldn't say that we're the true feminists or something like that.
yeah, well,
That's not
I mean,
really
yeah,
a
exactly.
title we want to adopt. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you got to try and adopt their language, I suppose. But no, just segueing. I mean, like there was a case today where the Liberal candidate for McNamara, it's been revealed that not too long ago he was a Greens member, a member of the Greens political party down in Victoria, which, by the way, is probably the most radical division of the Greens. And not only that, he worked for former Victorian Greens Senator Richard Di Natale. And add to that, he actually wrote in a tweet one time, 90% renewable energy by 2030. Now, that's the kind of future I want for my children. So not only is he just, accidentally signed a form and it happened to be for the Greens, he's actively endorsing Greens policies. And now he's expected to be the next MP that we have for the federal seat of Macnamara. And this is a winnable seat. But I guarantee no action will be taken against him, despite very clearly demonstrating attitudes which are antithetical to the Liberal Party, i.e., being a member of an opposition party. Now, Ben Britton committed not even a crime, in my eyes at least, but half the transgression that this guy has. But there'll be no, I guess, action taken against him. So, yeah, it is a bit disappointing that there is these kind of ranked double standards. I, for one, like that there is a bit of a raft of viewpoints, but it's a shame that we see these ranked double standards and that they're only used to apply to people who hold a view that is more right of centre. So, yeah, it's a shame.
Exactly. I'll let you move on in a second. I'll let Matthew jump in. But
I just want to.
yeah, no,
Oh,
just quickly. I'll go quickly. But I mean, Dutton had a generational opportunity here where Trump just got re-elected second term. Arguably, the rhetoric was a little bit more radical in some ways than 2016. He came in proving that even though historic defeat, his supporters stormed the Capitol in what the media claimed was an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government. So he's been branded as a radical outsider, criminal. He received a bunch of charges, and yet he
two
still
attempted
won
assassinations.
2 attempted assassinations. I'd say that although his policy positions are a bit weaker this time round, nonetheless, that is what the public perceives him to be as this radical. Yet Dutton comes in and he has an opportunity here to seize the imagination of the next generation of right wingers, people that are probably apolitical at this point, young guys that see no potential in politics and instead they're going to just try to get their money up and go into a career in the private sector. They're deciding to completely tap out of politics. What Dutton could have come in and said is that he represents us, that he actually understands where we're coming from. Our country's being taken out from under us. And so he will put in place a radical platform where we will see immigration cut, we will recognize the problems of multiculturalism, multiracialism. He will recognize that young men's future is being taken out from them by feminism and how that has been legislated in the courts, etc.,
Yeah.
etc. And he could have captured the imagination, and he would have had the future. Maybe I don't know. It would have been a tough election to win on the ground, but that's the kind of long-term thinking which could have won over a large chunk of people. Maybe not this generation, but the next generation.
Yeah, and one
Towards
thing
a
I just want to
right-wing
mention,
platform.
one thing I want to mention there is you mentioned at the start he could have taken on a more radical approach. And whilst I agree that if you look at today's current strain of politics, that all the ideas that you said then would be considered radical. But to my mind, none of those ideas are radical. And we need to get to a point where we shift the Overton window so much that those ideas are not seen as radical. I mean, even in the last US election, hate to go back to it, but even in the last few months prior to November 3rd, I think it was November 5th, maybe actually. the Democrats started to become the party of being strong on borders. They tried to move a policy that stopped illegal border crossings, because Trump shifted the narrative and the rhetoric around the topic of keeping control of your own borders so far that the Democrats were like, oh my goodness, we now have no friends on the side of open borders, and we have to cave and be a party that is pro stronger borders. And I think we need to see the inverse of that happen in Australia, whereby those ideas that you mentioned, John, and a platform that Peter Dutton could have hypothetically run on, something far more galvanizing and by today's standards radical, could become more just common sense in future. And that's all about shifting the Overton window. The more people continue to be black-pilled, I'm sure a lot of the young listeners will understand what black-pilled means. Essentially, people who don't want to be involved in politics because they think it's all just a waste of time and that everything's irredeemable. Because, yeah, it's really important that people aren't black-pilled, and that even though things might look pretty grim, that they start to be more involved, because I'm 25, just turned 25. I'm going to be on this planet for, at least I hope, another 60 years. And I can't resign myself to the fact that this country is going to a wasteland. And we see what happens. I mean, the United Kingdom, in my opinion, has gone down that path. And that's a product of big government. It's a product of excess immigration, signing up to things like the European Union, which they are still seeing the effects of right now, and a lack of cultural assimilation. And that's why you've essentially got the dismantling of the two-party system over there, with Reform now leading in the polls. So, look, plenty to unpack there, but yeah, no, it's important what you mentioned there, John, and I think it's really important that we see that kind of trajectory changing in the future.
I think it's good you bring up the example of Britain, because I think that is the archetypical, or even Canada, but more so the UK, archetypical fall of the West, if you were to say. And as you point out, it's all those reasons. But I think first and foremost, the reason that happened was a weak conservative movement. You had a long and storied tradition of conservative party in England standing up for the country. You have leaders through the interwar and early post-war periods who took this opinion that whilst they were the party of the upper class, the educated, but they also had a view to a preferential option for the poor. Whereas under Margaret Thatcher and then on, there seems to be a shift, not only in the UK, but also in America under Reagan, towards more of a market liberalisation. And this can tie into tariffs and whatnot, or to tax policy. But also in Australia, we have this, whether or not it's true, but this perception that the Liberal Party stands as the party for the wealthy, and not for the party of the everyman, which you can see Dutton trying to argue with that. But I think over the last 70 years, there has been a particular focus on the conservative movement for the enrichment of certain groups of society, which has left the whole society weaker for it. When you've used the example of mass migration into the UK and no assimilation, if you're the party of wealthy business owners who want to use cheaper labour to make higher profits, you are not concerned with how immigrants act in communities, how they assimilate within communities that you're not a part of, schools that your children don't go to, churches that you are not a part of. So those issues do not affect people within the mainstream conservative movement that have made choices over the decades to where we are now, and we're the worse off for it now. That really wasn't a question, but I want to go back to something you said earlier around Trump being the driving force behind the shift in the Overton window in America. Now, obviously, they have a different political system where Trump is the president, akin to King Charles here. He's the executive. But also with Trump, there seems to be this cult of personality, this idolatry even behind Trump. You see these massive bronze statues being erected of Trump by so-called Christians, by the way. But there seems, and you can see it on like the tariff policy. Trump announces tariffs. All his supporters are saying, this is the greatest policy ever. American golden age incoming. This creates so many domestic jobs. He pauses it, then people are like, oh, this is the art of the deal. He's a genius negotiator. And I think we do want someone like Trump who can shift the Overton window, make what is radical now acceptable tomorrow. But how do we do that without this blind loyalty, this idolatry, this cult of personality, which comes with its own negative downsides?
Yeah, definitely. And it has to be mentioned that, people say we need an Australian Trump. I think we're at the point now where Trump is not, people have tried to call him Machiavellian. They've kind of call him, that he's a tenet of populism. I think really he's his own phenomena. He is Trumpism. And I think there has to be a point now where you say that this guy has, defied so many people's expectations, has broken so many rule books of politics regarding things like scandals and things like that, where he now deserves his own ism. So to think that it can be easily replicated is not something that is true, because there are populists all over the world. There are nationalists all over the world. But there really is only one person who's typified what it is to be like Trumpism, and that is, of course, him himself. So I don't think that we're necessarily going to have a repeat of someone like him and that kind of idolatry over here, because once he passes, maybe he passes some of it on to his children, but I really do think that's a phenomena that will die with as much as he will die eventually. Despite many people have tried to make him die a lot earlier, as we've seen during the election campaign, but I think he'll, God willing, he will live out the rest of his life. But no, on the topic of tariffs, I really do think, yeah, it does show that a lot of his fan base is people who are just blindly supporting him. That's something that I like to think I've been a little bit more principled on. I personally don't buy that tariffs in the year 2025 are the solution to bringing back manufacturing. Now, I'm not going to profess that I know what is. I would attribute a lot of what's happened to the decline of manufacturing to things like a low birth rate, and also things like excessive union pressure. And I think that you look at Trump's policies on tariffs. I think that a lot of his decisions to put tariffs on organizations was based on the trade deficits incurred with all of these other nations. But when you think about it, like, I have a trade deficit with my local Woolworths, in the sense that I trade things that I get from them, so I only take things from them. Sure, I give them money, but I'm not trading anything back to them. So I have a trade deficit with them, but it doesn't mean that they should take I guess, action against me to prohibit me from buying a loaf of bread or a carton of milk. So I think that that's something that was fundamentally flawed in the way that he rolled out the tariffs, but also with no consideration for, I guess, allies. I mean, I know now that he's walked it back. It now seems that he's taking more decisive action on China. I think that's a great opportunity to use it as a way to really stranglehold China, who are trying to be imperialist. And I do think, by the way, it's also a better approach than, military intervention or things like USAID, which I'm very glad that he's funded, or boots on the ground, or any kind of foreign wars that we're fighting, whether that be in the Middle East or in Ukraine. I think this is a far better way to go about, seeking international diplomacy and international action, simply to, increase the thing like tariffs on a foreign actor like China. But yeah, I didn't like his approach that he was originally using, which was, trying to bring back, I guess, factories and jobs to the United States. And I say that solely because we know that every factory that would be opened in the United States is not going to employ as many people as it would have in the year 1920. In the year 1920, when a factory opened, there was tens of thousands of people working there. Now it's entirely guided by machines, and the only jobs that you're providing are people pushing a button, and they're low productivity jobs.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
and also to say to that, it's also low, very low productivity manufacturing. So it'd be stuff like making water bottles. So stuff
Yes.
that has limited profit margins, that won't pay high paying jobs to Americans. And there's a reason they've been shipped to Vietnam, to China, to Bangladesh, to those sorts of countries, because there is a wage disparity. And those
Yes.
products can be so cheap because, I mean, if you want to call it slave labor, they are using slave labor.
They are, yeah. And look, I will just say one thing, because all of this sounds quite negative, in the sense that, do I think there'll ever be a manufacturing reboom back in Australia? Well, no. Partly I think that's because of technology, but also, and this comes back to probably my number one issue in politics and political issues, is a low birth rate. I saw a map recently where it had a chart of the entire world, and it basically created a set of large bubbles, right? Because everyone likes a good diagram. And on these bubbles, the size of the bubbles was dictated to, okay, of the next 1,000 babies that would be born on the planet from this second right now, as I snap my fingers, which country will they be born in? And I think it was something like 40% of all of the babies to be born in the next 1,000 babies will be born in India and China. And in the long run, you can put as many tariffs as you want on. You can put as many immigration restrictions as you want on. You can put as many foreign interference things on, as long as that is able to continue, whereby 40% of the next generation coming through is going to be from two emerging superpowers, or some would say they're already emerged superpowers in India and China. You're simply not going to be able to keep up with them, whether that be in manufacturing, whether that be in your economic growth, things like that. If you have a declining birth rate, you're not going to be able to do that. And the only way you could mitigate that would be having mass immigration into Australia, which you've already tried, and that's got its own faults. So fundamentally, the way out of all of this, I think, is to increase our domestic birth rate. I think right now it's at a rate of 1.5 children per woman. And whilst that doesn't seem too far from 2.1, it is actually catastrophically far from 2.1, in the sense that when you think about it, of the amount of Australians currently living on this planet right now, let's say it's 26 million, even though a lot of them are recently arrived immigrants or even temporary people here on a temporary visa. That means that in one generation from now, there will be 75% of people, 75% of those Australians in terms of the raw numbers. Now, of course, we don't see that playing out because of immigration. But as I said, that comes with its own issues, and the UK is experiencing that too. So, yeah, that's the solution out of all of it. We need to have more babies. So anyone listening? No, I'm just. but
Get
no, I really
with
do.
the missus. That's what
Yes,
Barclay said.
exactly. I think it's something that, it's also a byproduct of technology. The fact that people would rather speak to people on a chat room. People get addicted to things like pornography and those kind of societal ills that really drive the idea of, hey, maybe I shouldn't have a kid. Another thing is probably home ownership too. The idea that a lot of people think, well, I'm currently on a 6-month lease here, and I don't necessarily want to get my wife pregnant because, well, I could be out homeless in 6 months. I don't know where I'm going to be living because my lease is going to be over. So, and I don't want to have a 1 to 2 month old in that situation. So, these kind of different things that the modern man and the modern woman are juggling with are what is contributing to a low birth rate. But we need to try and push through it. One thing that really I was only realized the other day is that right now the average mum and dad, they want to give little Johnny, their 2 or 3-year-old, his own bedroom in their house. Now, for most of human history, young kids growing up in the family home, they slept in bunk beds, where there'd be 4 or 5 kids in a room, right? But now we have this nostalgic idea that everyone has their own little personalized room with the rocket ship up on the wall or the My Little Pony in the corner, now, that's what we've concocted now. I don't know if that's because of films or because we're always aspiring to give our kids better than what we got, but it's drastically unrealistic when it's so hard to get into the housing market, let alone get into a housing market for a family of 4 or 5 kids and have a room for all of them. You kind of have to downsize and realize that most kids for the entirety of human history grew up living in bunk beds and grew up living close to each other, having to deal with each other's arguments and disagreements. And that's something that, at least from what I see in my community, people in this day and age don't seem to think. They think, oh, okay, well, I've got 3 kids, so I need a 4-bedroom household. Whereas, so I can't buy one, so because it's too expensive. So I think that's a change in mindset that needs to occur, just some more realistic expectations, I suppose. So that was a bit of a ramble there, but I know that it's all hopefully tying back into the greater issue that, I think if we have more babies, we can see a return in things like manufacturing, having more goods made here, and hopefully a stronger, more prosperous society. So, yeah.
I think you bring up a very good point around, we have a small population, right? There's roughly 13 million in the labour force. Of that, maybe 9 to 10 million are productive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only going to shrink over time with aging populations, low birth rates. And do we really want to be pushing, millions of people into manufacturing flip-flops, manufacturing T-shirts, manufacturing, these low-cost goods? Or do we want to keep them in mining, mining iron ore, high-paying jobs, refining minerals, rare earth minerals, professional scientific jobs, engineering, geologists, all that around mining, plus social services, education,
Yeah.
healthcare, other social services that are crucial to our standard of living. So there is like a choice we have to make in this country. Whilst it would be good to see a return of targeted manufacturing, we're not going to go back to the early 20th century in this. And I think with regards to manufacturing policy, I'm quite this is one of the few things I'll say Joe Biden did really well on, was he kind of took an approach of, whilst it was still based on the liberal world order of free trade, he kind of drew America's entanglements across the world back into the sphere of influence. You saw this particularly with superconductors. He passed the CHIPS Act, which I think Trump supported, or has
He didn't oppose it. Yeah.
He didn't oppose it, at least.
Yeah.
And that brought superconductor manufacturing domestically into America, something that's critical to every industry in America right now. Every industry, from agriculture to mining to healthcare to financial services. And so it's stuff like that, targeted high value industries that can be taken away from places like Taiwan, which are in China's sphere of influence, into America's sphere of influence, or into America itself. And that's something, as Australia, we should be looking towards. What are areas that we can specialize in, stuff that we can produce that will give high paying jobs, help build communities, help give people homes, build families, and build the social fabric.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think you guys still got me there. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think that, two things stick out to me is that I think people often have this kind of nostalgia for, the guy who works like a 9 to 5 job, or even more absurd hours in a factory, manufacturing for Ford or Holden. Let's be clear, these people were not necessarily happy. These were jobs where you didn't have any great working conditions. There was no air conditioner. And are these the jobs that people want to be brought back, and that we should halt all technology to bring those jobs back unrealistically? And that was something that I've seen a lot of people at least have this kind of nostalgia, the people who are relentlessly pro-tariff. And then the other thing is, it also seems to be coupled with these people who have this, I guess, romanticized view of the 1950s, of the classic "Honey, I'm home," or the woman has baked out an entire spread for dinner for the husband and the 3 or 4 kids. Well, I would also mention, and this was something that I saw recently on social media, that if you actually unpacked what was typically in the meals of a 1950s household, even like a high income household, they were typically eating out of cans. By today's standards, all the fresh produce and the fruits and vegetables were withered. They were often quite stale. A lot of the breads that they would eat. So, I know that there is this kind of romanticism, and I get that. And of course, we know that the cost of these goods has definitely gone up. Even adjusting for inflation, a lot of people kind of had this, I think they see the iconography of the lady coming out with the polka dot dress and planting a kiss on the husband's cheek, and as he comes home from work, and they kind of really aspire to that. But I think there's so much that we can be actually grateful for in the modern day society. Now, if you look at culture, I think we've completely degraded our culture. That's definitely an argument, but that's a separate argument in my view. As far as today's living standards have gone, they've dramatically increased. And I do think part of that is because, of things like technology, and that things like technology shouldn't be shunned. And that just because you have a union saying that, oh, we don't want automation on our workforce, well, think about, does automation mean that someone doesn't have to work some kind of pitiful job in a factory from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m.? Does it mean that the cost of doing the business and the costs that I pay on the shelf when I go to do grocery shopping, does it mean that it's not that high? So, yeah, there's little things that I think people don't necessarily consider. And this is maybe an argument which sadly has become an argument trotted out by the left now. Because isn't it funny how the left used to be pro-tariff because, it would cut off unethical supply chains, but now because Trump is so pro-tariff, they've become the party of being anti-tariffs. And it's crazy how politics has really been changed again in this Trumpism kind of period. But no, that's kind of my unapologetic view, that when Trump talks about tariffs, particularly as a means of bringing back manufacturing, I don't necessarily think that it holds the silver bullet that he thinks it does when we used to have tariffs and they were far more effective at bringing back manufacturing in the 1920s, which I think is what he often cites, right? Like I think he calls, I think it was the period just before, around the 1920s when he talked about how all of our income was taken in through tariffs. Now this is a separate argument in the sense that I do think that it would be an interesting argument to see how if he increased tariffs, but he offset that by abolishing federal income tax. That would be an argument which I think would be very, very interesting to hear. But until he looks at extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which he needs to do before the midterms, I'm not necessarily on board with his sweeping tariffs, which he applied and then retroactively reversed. So, yeah.
I think
I'm gonna
that whole
jump in.
notion.
I'm gonna jump
I'll just
in.
say something quickly, John.
All
But
right.
the whole notion that you can cut income tax, which gives you, I don't want to say a number, maybe $1 trillion a year, and replace it with tariffs instantly, I think is whimsical at best. The size of the American government is so much larger than it was in the 1920s and 1910s that even a GST or in addition or VAT in addition to tariffs can't cover it. So this idea that he's going to cut all income tax is ridiculous. Like obviously he can deliver tax cuts with a tariff. People take home 2,000 more a year. That's something that could be done. But this talk about, and this goes back into this cult of personality, this idolatry, where Trump says something that's on its face stupid. People just say, "Yep, obviously it's going to happen. He's the greatest president ever. Golden age."
Right.
Yeah. Sorry, you go, John.
Yeah, it appears I have to be the villain of the podcast. I'm going to come in and defend the tariffs here.
Of course, no.
And manufacturing as well. When I do this, I don't necessarily intend to defend manufacturing for the sake of bringing jobs, but I intend to do so from the perspective of national security more than anything. And so it doesn't bother me even one iota if we have hundreds of factories and not one single person is working in them except for maybe the repairman for the automated arms which build the cars on the line, on the conveyor belt. And the reason for that is that it is far preferable to the current economy, which is based on I'd say one real asset, which is us digging up rocks from the ground and selling them overseas and other minerals. That's a real thing. That's a thing that we actually are producing and contributing. I don't think it is good the way that we do it. I don't think that we're maximally benefiting from that. I don't think it's benefiting our national interest the way that foreign companies are getting a lot of the profit from our mining sector. But I do think that is a real part of our economy that actually is contributing meaningfully, as opposed to, as a counterpoint, I'll say these email jobs, these services, the service economy, which is growing and now consumes a large part of our economic output. So I'll say that it'd be much preferable to have, rather than not maybe people working in these jobs, but us producing cars and us producing. I think back to how we've had to import our trams and our small trains and our ferries and our ships and our submarines from overseas, from America, from France, from Germany, from various other countries, small European countries, where clearly it's not because of their massive population that they're able to produce high quality, tangible goods, which can then be brought up by countries around the world. I think by us becoming a manufacturing superpower through the use of technology, not by ignoring it, and also benefited by a tariff regime that is a bit more intelligent than Trump's, one that is industry specific, and not just based on a whole country will be tariffed at a certain percent. We could actually build up, a manufacturing sector within the country, which would make us a bottleneck for various goods around the world, which would actually make us geostrategically more valuable as well to our allies.
Definitely.
Also, better positioned ourselves. We'll have greater sovereignty if we're not reliant on Taiwan for microchips, and we're actually the ones exporting that around the world. So all of a sudden, it'll be everyone else who is coveting our goods and trying to get the best deals with us if we're able to produce things the world actually needs. The world doesn't need more I don't even know, like, service sector jobs doesn't need more Uber drivers or something like that. Doesn't need more,
Mm.
cafes and stuff like that. It needs more actual goods. Imagine we were producing transport. Imagine we were manufacturing microchips. These are the things we should be looking towards, not because of the jobs or whatever, but because it would make us a more sovereign country with actual ownership over our future. And if tariffs are what's required to get us there, and I believe that they are,
Mm.
then I think we should definitely implement them in a more intelligent way than Trump has in
Yeah,
America.
I'd say yeah. The key thing you said then is that they were industry specific and not nation specific, and I think that's where Trump's really fallen foul. Is that, and particularly a lot of people, people who did economics like myself and Matthew on the podcast, we can see that clearly he's devolved these ideas of what the tariff rate will be based on the trade deficit, which is
Yeah.
actually kind of just like a pie in the sky way of doing it. There's no real rationale for that. So I think industry specific is definitely the way to go. And more specifically, yeah, you mentioned national security. I think fundamentally, when you see something like energy, it's now has to be a discussion about national security, because we've seen that if we have a country like China and we're so reliant on China, if we go back to an Australian context for the moment they enter into a war, even with one of our allies, then what we're going to see is that they can just turn off the grid for us, or they can stop. They can stop allowing us to, have the lights on. Really, so those kind of things are, yeah. When they're a matter of national security, I definitely think that a more protectionist outlook is maybe more defendable. I think, and should definitely be more closely looked at. But for a lot of industries that actually do, for the most part, have a lot of their manufacturing bases even in Queensland, they still do have intermediary goods which are going to be impacted by a potential tariff. Now, Australia has gotten out pretty good. It's only a 10% tariff. Um, but yeah, I think it's a 10% tariff on our beef. But I think the unintended consequence is it might actually push us to instead do more negotiating with China to offshore that beef. Because, yes, I agree that as much as we have an abundance of resources here and they should be used more domestically. Again, that's more the national security argument. The fact is, we do export a lot of beef around the world, and beef is a finite, or not a finite good, but it's a perishable good in the sense that you can't just hoard as much beef as possible, like you can hoard as much uranium deposits or coal deposits. No, our farmers and graziers here should be free to export that beef to every corner of the world, because Australian beef is great and we do have a surplus supply of it. We've got plenty of beef here in Australia. Anywhere you go, you can get beef. And I guess the question is, Trump's tariffs are actually going to make us more inclined to give that and trade that beef with China. And I don't know if that was the intended consequences from an Australian perspective. Of course, Trump is not thinking from the Australian perspective, but I don't really know that his tariffs are encouraging us to be any more or less reliant on China, for instance.
Well,
Uh,
when I'm giving a defense of tariffs, I'm giving it from our perspective in that we should implement them. And obviously,
Mm.
it's disadvantageous to us for other countries to be putting up tariffs on our goods. And so, yeah, I mean, I'd prefer the US brought down tariffs on our goods, and our prime minister should be negotiating that. If we actually had some more bargaining chips, we might be able to do something. For example, if we were more crucial to America's defense, and let's say Asia Pacific, we ran the joint, then all of a sudden we've got something that we can actually push back against using. But that's not the case, really. I mean, we're here. We're like the US has been greatly benefited by our defense contributions, and by our I'm sure foodstuffs and other imports as well. But
Hmm.
we're certainly not, like I was saying, a bottleneck in the global economy where people must do business with us because we produce the best, let's say, military technology in the world or something like that. Or we produce the microchips. I mean, it's not
Mm.
just Taiwan. Korea produces them. The US still produces analog microchips quite a lot. And we're saying all of this, a lot of manufacturing has gone out of the US, and yet they do produce a specific type of microchip which doesn't require a lot of innovation, whereas Taiwan and Korea are doing a lot more in terms of manufacturing based on designs which are produced in various other Western nations. So it's not
Mm.
so much a thing that there are no examples of it being done. I think it's purely down to a commitment to free trade globalism, which has existed since the Keating era, I'd say, was when it really firmly came into effect. Around maybe Hawke Keating, I'd say, was when, and then obviously Fraser was very much in favour of that. And we need to go back to a time where we're looking at the protectionism of Alfred Deakin, which built our country up into what it is today, and ultimately won the minds of Australians instead of the free trade movement of George Reed. But sorry, that's a little bit of ancient history for you.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I'll also add one other little bit tidbit. I'm actually going to host an event later next month with my former employer John Humphreys from the Australian Taxpayers Alliance and Dan Ryan from the National Conservative Institute of Australia, I believe. I'm hoping to host that later next month, just pending a few dates. But anyone in the Brisbane area, maybe get in touch with one of the hosts or try and look out for an event that is going to be discussing for and against tariffs. So I think it's a great discussion. We need to talk about it more. It's going to dominate the headlines. It's not just dominated the last few weeks, but it will continue to dominate the headlines. So it's a very, very worthwhile discussion. And I take your point about even looking back historically at what we've done with the Deakin years and had an economy, entirely based off tariffs. So it is an interesting discussion, though. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on a couple of things John has said. He uses the examples of USA, Germany, and France, and I think USA. We often compare ourselves culturally, at least, to the USA. I think economically, the countries like USA or China, these global superpowers, are really hard to compare ourselves with. But Germany and France, I think, are an interesting comparison because rather than taking the isolationist approach that America currently is, they're quite expansionist. Even France, you could still say, has a colonial empire. Germany's tied their economy to the euro. So they're tied their economy to Italy, Spain, and Greece, which really devalues their currency, which promotes exports and devalues imports. So that's something we could do in the Asia Pacific, tie ourselves to a common market with places like PNG or Fiji or Vanuatu to devalue our currency to promote exports. But that will come at the expense of decreases in standard of living for Australians. You're less likely, your dollar will go less far buying foreign goods. That is one way to naturally protect your exports. Or France, which I'll say this is quite unethical. There's countries in the Sahel which they've instituted a franc there, which is half of their franc, and they can only exchange that franc for their franc. So they tie those vast countries with massive caches of natural resources to themselves. And as John was saying about, being a country of significance, having these industries, or being a significant trading partner in the world, I think this can be quite easily done with our current strengths. You have a growing need for new emerging minerals for green technology, so vanadium, HPA, moly, I can't say that word, MPD, I think it's referred to as. And so we can, become specialists not only through a natural abundance of these minerals, but also through the refinement process and ship it off to somewhere like America, which has the industry base, which has the subsidies, which has the population and the know-how to manufacture these goods. And that is a way to make ourselves relevant politically in this broader Western sphere of influence. And we could do the same with Europe. You talk about beef, maybe not agricultural goods, but mineral goods to Europe. If they want to industrialize with the threat of Russia, and then the issue of reciprocity. So if we're a small country which is highly dependent on imports, and if we start the tariff regime, how are we going to stop countries that are much bigger, like China, replicating or even increasing on tariffs? What we saw during the Scott Morrison years. Scott Morrison blamed China for COVID. China responded with tariffs on Australian wine, Australian beef. It decimated farmers. And then we put tariffs back on them. It wasn't nearly as effective because they have their export market. We're a smaller percentage of their export market than they are as a percentage of our import market. So we are more dependent on China than they are on us.
Yes. Yep.
And I don't see a way forward where we can kind of build ourselves as being a China or America where we can do what we want and get away with it realistically in the international market.
Yeah, it is going to be quite hard, and yeah, I think there's another point which I haven't properly unpacked that John made, which was about how we're basically allowing foreign companies to dig up all of our resources from the
Yeah.
ground and ship it out at the lowest price, or not necessarily the lowest price, but at market price, and that's something where I think that even people who believe in lower taxes and who believe in free trade, should believe in something like mining royalties that
Mm-hmm.
are just high enough that you don't you obviously do. Like, I'm not anti-mining, right? I still believe that we should incentivize companies to mine at least, because I think the alternative of an economy run entirely on renewables is not desirable and not cheap at all. But it is important that we do have some kind of form of mining royalties, because ultimately that is the property of us. I mean, it's literally in the land. So yeah, even people who are free traders do defend things like mining royalties, but I mean, segueing it back to the current election, though, I don't know if you guys, I guess this is maybe extending my biography a little bit more, but the last few weeks I've asked a few questions of some of the people who are running in the upcoming election who don't believe that we should have any form of mining here in Australia. In Simon Holmes a Court, who is the quasi leader of Climate 200 and the Teals unofficial political party, and also Elizabeth Watson Brown, who's one of the three Greens MPs where I live in Brisbane. And you simply try to ask them how renewables will lower the cost of power, and they can't answer the question. And in my instances, I've been tossed out of the event. Even more so, Simon Holmes a Court said, "Don't be a dick." And I think, yeah, it's something that I go back to. The nature of this podcast is the ability to have these kind of discussions and to agree and disagree civilly. And that's something that's not even being done right now by our current political leaders. In the sense that you ask them a challenging question and they toss you out of their event. And these are community forums. They aren't political party meetings or anything. I'm not sneaking in. I'm not using an alias or a disguise. I'm just going in as Barclay McGain from the General Public, and you're not allowed to ask questions. So,
They're scared of
yeah,
you, mate.
plenty of work to do.
They're scared of the Barclay.
Yeah, exactly. That's it, mate.
And I think energy, whilst like you have a certain position that would disagree with John, myself, and the rest of us because we take a more balanced approach in renewables.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the biggest problem with renewables, it kind of ties in with the what you were talking about mining, is that most of these major wind farms and solar farms are owned by international companies. And those
Yeah.
international companies lobby the Labor Party through the Clean Energy Council to only promote wind and solar. And that is for the sole explicit benefit of their rent-seeking companies seeking profit on Australian consumers. So the energy market, in brief, works. Inflows have to meet outflows for the market to be in flux. And so at any given time, the energy market operator will demand a certain amount of like gigawatt of energy production from wholesalers. Those
Mm-hmm.
wholesalers will be gas producers in the gas fields. They either turn it up or turn it down when they need to. Wind or solar farms, which can't. Coal powered stations, which have struggles with turning up. And the problem with retiring coal and increasing wind and solar is that it is unreliable. And so you need a massive investment in gas to offset the unreliability in wind and solar and hydro and batteries, which are expensive in their own right and have their own ecological impacts. But we can't have a system that is 100% wind and solar. We will need gas, and gas is extremely expensive. And how the market operates is that every supplier to the national energy market that the AMO selects gets paid at the highest rate of any producer. So you'll have wind and solar, which are cheap as a wholesale product, but gas isn't. And so you'll have wind and solar companies who own those solar farms getting paid rates well in excess of what it costs them to produce. And so they're going to make massive profits off the Australian consumer. And we will not see energy prices go down under a wind and solar only energy market.
Yeah.
Particularly when not only on cost to wholesalers, but also on transmission costs, transmission developments, upkeep, all the extra costs that go into your final retail price. And that's where this issue of nuclear energy comes in, which I think Peter Dutton did really good in introducing, and Ted O'Brien, the Shadow Minister for Energy. But they haven't. And again, I think this goes more broadly. It winds back into what we talked about, Chris Foley, is the Liberal Party is unwilling to kind of talk to these issues. They get put into the frame, the scaremongering campaign of Labor, and they get put into this framework of we play by their characterization of the issue. When the issue is nuclear energy provides baseload power, which limits the impacts of minimal operational demand, it steadies the market, and it provides cheap power that can offset deficiencies in wind and solar at a cheaper price than gas, and is cleaner than gas, and is more safe than gas and coal. And ultimately, at the end of the day, produce energy that is cheaper for consumers.
Yeah, definitely. And, I hosted an event recently, back end of last year, with Stephen Nobakowski. He's a former member of the Greens, used to be big supporter of wind and solar. And he's actually taken the environmentalist approach. And I'm not normally one to be the greenie in a discussion, but you see the devastation that the wholesale clearing of a lot of our regional and agricultural areas in Queensland, they're just being bulldozed, in order to build these large wind and solar farms, and they're being done under the guise of there was I think it was a law back in the 1920s or 30s in Queensland, where a project that was deemed to be of statewide significance could involve the government forcibly coming onto your land and basically issuing you with a notice that your land would be acquired by the state government for a matter of statewide security. And now that was, of course, done during World War II or in World War One, or maybe on the back of World War One. Basically the government saying, hey, just in the instance whereby where you live or the property that you own becomes an area where we definitely need to defend our own country from invasion, and things like that, then we are able to do that. And I think a lot of Australians are amenable to that. But what they're not amenable to is that law now in the year 2025 being interpreted to, have whole-scale wind farms and whole-scale solar farms in the name of, changing or preventing warming of the planet by 1 or 2 degrees. And Australia's only 1% of global emissions, so it's totally bonkers. But yeah, you're seeing all of these, forests and even native bird populations being wiped out to build these monstrosities, and they're super expensive. They can't be built by the private sector. They need whole scale subsidies, and it's ironic that the Greens don't support or at least oppose what's happening here on the ground in Queensland. Not in Brisbane, of course. They'd never have them built in their own backyards in the leafy suburbs of Brisbane, but in regional areas where they say to a farmer, well, look, instead of being able to use that area of your property, we're actually going to build a ginormous wind turbine, and which is going to kill all the birds. So that's basically what their current proposal is, and it's got nothing to do with being green or environmentally friendly at all.
And it's even worse than that when you look at the actual environmental impact assessments these companies do, and the requirements that the state and federal government, depending on which Department of Environment reviews it. And you look at these projects like even the biggest ones are the pumped hydro schemes. And you look, they're going to put them in ridge lines which are untouched by civilization for obvious reasons. They're not going to flood people's homes. But these are areas with, distinct flora and fauna which are endangered because of human activity in Eastern Australia. And they're going to, and all a company needs to do to say we're going to protect these species is we'll buy the equivalent loss of land in far west Queensland, and I guess the sugar gliders can survive out in the desert. And it's very antithetical to the green movement, is how they've changed from protecting the environment in meaningful ways, water pollution, toxic waste, deforestation, and it's gone into this more theoretical climate change, which we won't debate today, but they've shifted from tangible environmental impacts which are real to theoretical future impacts which may or may not be real. And I think just looking at the time, I think we should wrap it up there. We can continue this discussion next time you're on, Barclay, if you want.
Of course. Yeah, no, definitely. No, it was great to chat, lads. And as much as we touched on plenty of different topics, I think finally it's the conversations that need to be having had in the modern day politics and even in this election, but we're currently not seeing it. As far as I'm concerned, it's a challenge of who can give the most money to random community groups or multicultural hubs or just whole scale handouts to people, giving them $125 of their power bill. It's really sad that politics has evolved into a game of handouts, but hopefully more discussions like this and and more of the public waking up, we can get more of a robust battle of ideas. So yeah.
This 1 hour and 15 minutes is a more robust policy debate than anything Albanese or Dutton has done on the campaign trail or in their debates.
100%, yeah.
And we're just
So
a couple
true.
of young blokes who, frankly, shouldn't be leading this discussion, but such is the
We
state of
shouldn't even have
Australia.
access to a microphone, frankly. I mean, considering.
Hey, speak for yourself.
Thanks for coming on,
the
Barclay.
stuff
Thanks
John
for
has
being a
done.
good sport. Yeah, the things I've done, heinous.
No
but,
worries.
no, we appreciate it. Before you jump off, I mean, people are going to have this on their mind. Who are the top picks for the upcoming federal election up in Queensland? Who are you putting down as your top? How are you going to do your ranking in terms of selection?
Yeah, well, I mean,
Who you
I don't
think
know. Look, I think the issue in my local area is I'm living in the seat of Griffith, and the challenge there is whether it's going to be the Labor or the Greens. So I guess you're ultimately forced, because it's compulsory preferential voting, that you have to put down a number, and as a result, the Greens will go last and Labor will go second last. So it'll
I
probably
disagree
mean
on
that.
that.
Yep, you disagree. Fair enough. Well,
That's
look,
all right. We don't
my
have
kind
much
of
time.
my
But,
kind of
yeah, go Barclay.
yeah. But yeah, no, I think that as long as people put Greens and Labor last and second last, I think honestly you can be doing a lot of good in your local community, and also the Teals. We need to piss them off too. But yeah,
What
no,
about
thanks so much for
Senate?
your
Let's
time,
go
guys.
Senate
Really
quickly.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Senate, where are you putting
Senate,
Jared Rennick?
Yeah, well, I mean, I get 6 picks, don't I? Because there's 6 people that get elected. So Jared Rennick's definitely going in there. Malcolm Roberts. There's a couple good people on the LNP ticket who I'd consider backing. Susan McDonald's fantastic. Haven't quite worked out the order yet, but thankfully we've still got a few more weeks to decide that. So, but
All
yeah,
right,
Jared
well,
Rennick I
thank
think is a standout, and yeah.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. And all right, we'll leave the audience with that. There's so much more we're going to be discussing in the lead up to the election, and we're going to have a lot of guests on who will be able to give more of an insider's view to what's going on, who they should be voting for, and all that's related. But thank you for joining us this week, Barclay. Thank you for joining me, Matthew. And I hope the audience has a great rest of their week.